Am I the first one here? Check, 1, 2, check. Good evening. This is at 6:05. This is a meeting of the Rules Subcommittee to discuss a couple of motions that were sent to this subcommittee. Mr. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Chairman Elliott?
Here.
Counsel Conway? Counsel Mercia?
Here.
3 present.
So as I mentioned, this is the Rules Subcommittee meeting to discuss 2 items. One is the establishment, or the expansion, I should say, of a number of boards and commissions in the city. And the purpose of expanding boards and commissions is to have alternate members in the event that some members are not present, to ensure a quorum. The second item was, or is, the establishment of a monument committee. So with that, if there's no questions from members of the subcommittee, so we take up the expansion of the boards and commissions first, and the monument committee second. Any questions?
No.
No? Okay. So with that, we have the city solicitor here with us. If you could, I believe this came from the manager's office, from the administration, and in regards to expanding the number of boards, could you just go through those boards that will be expanded, the purpose, the intent, and what we'll achieve from that?
Sure. There was a motion from Councilor Owen to expand the boards and commissions of the city. The purpose behind it was twofold. It was to address what is sometimes an issue with respect to different boards and commissions in terms of reaching a quorum, but it was also to create a more sort of inviting and diversified boards and commissions to get people, get residents engaged and interested in serving on these boards, and that the thought is, with respect to alternate positions, it is a good way of learning about the board that you might be interested in, sitting through the meetings, and then when an opening occurs, there's already a member who has a sense as to what the board has been doing, the types of issues and discussions that have taken place, and would result in a smooth transition. In terms of the boards and commissions that have been adjusted, there have been boards. Our land use boards and commissions have been addressed to some degree, at least. We were recently looking at the historic board, and that would require, if there were to be any changes, it would require changing the special act that adopted it or created it. We did expand the Board of Trustees of the library. The most recent board that is before you for later this evening and then at the council meeting, in terms of a report, this monument committee was also established by having some alternative members included from the start, if this were adopted.
Okay, questions? Could you go through, just for the folks at home, could you go through the list of those boards and commissions that would be expanded? I know we did receive a report.
I don't believe there has been a final rendering of all the boards and commissions. Some of them, frankly, are quite large. There are others that, as a practical matter, we see a significant turnover. Say the board dealing with sustainability. So for some of these where we're having a hard time maintaining the adequate number of members, I don't know if we're going to be immediately expanding those. We're sort of continuing to review the process. So, for example, with respect to the historic board, changes were made. It went to the historic board administrator. Some questions have been raised as to what category the new members would fall under, and as a result, we're still working on that. And what we've anticipated in response to this motion is that we just take one board at a time, study it, and then once it's appropriate, bring it forth for the council. So
okay, so I stand corrected. I thought this was the administration, but I do recall it was a motion by Councilor Noon. So this is just that motion that was referred here, and there's a public hearing. Is there a public hearing?
It's tonight, is it tonight?
Correct?
the public hearing is...
That was the purpose of holding this hearing before the 14th. Mr. Clerk, is that correct?
Is for the Monument Committee,
Oh,
Okay.
monument.
right?
Oh, just for the Monument
Just for the
Committee.
Monument Committee.
Okay. So is the administration going to come back with a recommendation on just one board at a time in response to that motion?
There was a response from the administration that they were following up and embracing the motion that was passed by the council to do that, and the approach that was taken was to begin reviewing the boards, and on a board-by-board basis, bring them before the council.
So is that going to require a public hearing each time there's a change to those boards and/or commissions?
Most of the time, that's what will be required. Again, in the case of the Historic Board, which we had hoped to bring before the council a couple of weeks ago, but again, we're addressing issues that were raised by the administrator. That would require a special act. It was like Chapter 566 of the Special Acts.
Okay, I have some other questions, but I'll go to the subcommittee members. Council Conway? And
Just for clarification, the length of time that's served on these boards, is it the same for each board, or does it vary? Is it a 2-year, 2 years when you're named?
Yeah, some of the boards will vary in terms of the years spent on the board. So, for example,
why wouldn't there be consistency? Why would they vary?
Well, some of them vary because the statute would require a set term, say for like the ZBA, and then our, say the Sustainability Board or Commission, one that's more of a creation, a municipal creation than a statutory creation. At the time of inception, a different period of time was established for that board.
Thank you.
Sure.
Council Marcia?
Most of these questions were mine as well, because I have a concern. Some would vary in alternative terms so that they all wouldn't be up at the same time. We're going to have to do each individual separately and then have public hearing on each. We're doing monument tonight.
So tonight we would do the Monument Committee, and this was established, this is before the council for 2 reasons. Primarily, it is before the council to sort of codify the methods of naming, renaming, and things of that nature. But secondly, it also, again, incorporates the motion made by Councilor Oon to...
And does that include the land that we have at the JFK Plaza for different ethnic groups that would like to possibly have a monument? Does that include them as well?
It's intended to, yes.
Okay.
So it would include any municipal property inside our buildings, outside our buildings, and it would be anticipated that the Monument Committee, once established, would put together some rules and regulations. Those would be presented to the council, and then we would make those public, so that all the groups would know what the process is if they were interested in having anything to a bench to a park, or things within municipal buildings.
So we would take the recommendation of this committee. It would still have to come before the council for approval, but with the understanding of what the board actually authorized. Would that be how we term it?
That could be. What the ordinance really is addressing is that the rules and regulations would first have to be approved by the council, and I suspect the rules and regulations might very well, particularly with council input, determine whether you want this committee to do the naming, whether the council wants to reserve final approval to themselves, and those are things that can be vetted.
For example, when the Laos people wanted to have their Laotian monument, there were rules in place, but we didn't know where, so we started with the planning department and Diane Trad, and we had that office meet with them to give them specifications of what is required. Like each monument had to have a base, had to be a certain size, could not be taller than others, so that it'd be all like uniformed. So this is what we'll go into, like this monument committee.
Absolutely. The Monument Committee would not only establish criteria, but there would be, because of the nature, the makeup of the Monument Committee, you would have people on here that have backgrounds that would be able to set rules and regulations as to recommended design standards, and things of that nature.
So they would set policy as well, so that's a very good idea. Thank you.
They would. It's intended to be comprehensive, and once all of that is put together, again, it would come back before this council for final approval.
So when you deal with the monument committee and you're dealing, let's say, not so much with the city property out here, but with parks, are we taking in consideration another board which oversees that, and that's the Board of Parks? Do we have them have input into this? Because they're the group that supersedes anything the Parks Subcommittee could do.
Right, and that's a great point. So this is designed to address all of these other areas. However, one thing that this board, if established, could do is set up some suggested rules and regulations for the Board of Parks as well. And in the same way that it would be presented to this council, if there's anything that is suggested to the Board of Parks, it could be suggested to the Board of Parks for formal adoption.
That's good. Thank you so much.
Council Conway. Council Milonato? No? Council Conway.
Yeah, thank you. This monument committee, who has the final decision on this? On any, is it the city council or the monument committee? Is that?
That would be
I
something.
wasn't quite clear on that.
So the monument, this council would have to approve the sort of rules and regulations as established by the monument committee. In those rules and regulations, it should speak to who ultimately would have the final say.
And
So-
what is the relationship with the Board of Parks? Can the monument committee supersede the Board of Parks, or do they work in conjunction?
It would be intended that they work in harmony. So if the monument committee had rules and regulations as it applied to the Board of Parks, they would make those recommendations to the parks as rules and regulations for the board to follow. But the board would have to approve them.
And one other question, when you talked about the background of individuals that be on that committee, can you just elaborate a little bit more what you mean by their background, their qualifications?
Sure. In the proposed ordinance, section 9-45, the monument committee shall be comprised of representatives from the following disciplines: 2 members with design and landscape background, 2 members from the arts community, 2 members with historic preservation knowledge, 2 members with urban planning background, 1 with legal, and then 2 alternate members. And so collectively, this was, I should say at the outset, this was something that we worked collaboratively on. It involved input from a number of different departments. Henry Marchand from special events, Diane Trad from planning and development. And so, and Steve Stoll had been involved in this as well from the historic board. The consensus was that these different disciplines and those representing them should be able to come up with a policy that would take into account aesthetic issues, historic issues, neighborhood issues, and the like.
I think this information is good for the public that are listening to this right now to understand how that board is made up. Thank you.
Sure.
So as I look at the membership, it's 11 members. I just feel that this is kind of big. It's kind of large. I mean, what I don't see is any representation like community members. I see the arts community and historic preservation, urban planning, all good. You just mentioned something, neighborhood leaders or community activists. Excuse me. Are these individuals going to be required to be residents of the city?
Currently, that requirement isn't there. However, these are things that could be added to the ordinance, certainly.
I personally think that they should be members of the community. Just if you're going to be naming something or dedicating something, I do strongly feel that that should be a requirement.
We could certainly, some of these have 2 members, but we could make a change to have, say, a representative from the neighborhood group would have a representative. As far as the number, it's really 9 voting members and then the 2 alternates.
Right. No, and I understand, you're trying to expand it to get individuals from all the
Yeah.
disciplines, but at a time when we're looking to expand, because we can't get folks involved, I understand. I suppose it's better to have more than less, and they are required to meet 4 times a year in their 3-year terms. Are they going to be staggered terms somehow, or?
There would be standard terms.
Over time it would be, okay. I personally would like to ensure that residents of the city serve on this board, so I don't know how other members
Make a
are.
motion to do that? I'd like to make a motion that in this particular monument committee, that I would request that they be all Lowell residents that are on that committee.
Motion by Council Marcia, seconded by Council Conway, requiring that members of the Monument Committee.
Sorry, just a question. So for some of these, we have run into this issue with some of our other boards where we have very specific requirements. I think some of the language that has been used is that you would have to be a resident or employed in the city. I don't know if that is something that would meet the mark that you're referring to, or if a couple of these, that there'd be a sort of a couple of waivers. I think, for example, in the dangerous dog ordinance, I think that there is some level of flexibility built in there that in order to meet all of the requirements of the different positions, that not everybody would have to be from the city.
I understand that. Well,
Yep.
Council Marcia, then Council Conway.
You know what the greatest thing would be? If they were not only Lowell residents, but Lowell employees that lived in the city. That would be even better.
Council Conway. Okay.
Madam Solicitor, I personally would rather have them living in the city, not someone outside the city. If they're going to be on one of our boards, I think it just makes sense. And just to follow up, do we have other boards where individuals are not City of Lowell residents?
Primarily, all of our boards have City of Lowell residents, but there are a few boards and a few positions where it is not necessarily required.
Well, I think certainly on this one here, the Monument Committee, they should very definitely be residents of the City of Lowell.
Okay, so there's one item, or I think there's one group that we might want to include in here, and that, is there a reason why a veteran organization is not included? I mean, thinking that there could be dedications to veterans.
We absolutely could add that in as well. There are the standards that are already set by the council for the veterans dedications, and that I think is why it wasn't duplicated here. But we certainly could. And it may be that once that groundwork is set, it may eventually make sense to sort of fold them in together, so
Okay.
long as the requirements are met.
So in the previous, there was a motion made by Council Marcia, seconded by Council Conway. Mr. Clerk, can we get a roll call on that? Yes.
Council Mercia.
Yes.
Council Conway.
Yes.
So what's the suggestion on community members, a neighborhood leader, and perhaps a member of the veteran community? Or how would you propose folding that in later? I understand that there is that veteran is veterans, is it a codified committee, or is it merely a,
I believe it's reviewed by the Veterans Office, and then it goes to a Veterans Committee for final.
I believe we just established a policy, correct? I mean, it's
Establishes
not
a
an
policy.
ordinance, it's just a veteran, it's a policy to vet requests for dedications of squares or locations, right?
Correct, but there's very specific criteria that needs to be met in order to be approved. I was just noting that if you have a veteran, if you add a veterans member to this, it may be that down the road, it may make sense to fold in those requirements into, and have it under the jurisdiction of the Monument Committee, subject to whatever final jurisdiction the council wishes to retain over it.
Okay. Any other comments, any other thoughts? Yeah, it's approaching 6:30, so do we want to include a veteran?
Yes.
And a motion by Councilor Conway, seconded by Councilor Mercia, to include a veteran, and as part of the 11, a neighborhood representative? Okay.
So the neighborhood groups would select someone,
Right.
and then it would be
Yeah.
approved by the council.
Right.
Okay, so how will we do this at public hearing time? Are these substantive changes that would require re-advertising on the membership aspect of it?
It likely wouldn't, these are changes that are not terribly substantive to the overall process. The
Okay.
clerk, I think, like to be recognized.
If that's the case, if I may,
Mr. Clerk?
Chairman, if that's the case, then probably the easiest transition would maybe to continue the public hearing, open it up and continue it for those changes, or just continue it before you open it up, I would suggest, and you wouldn't have to re-advertise.
I think that's a good
I think that makes
suggestion.
sense because we're looking at, I mean, we have a finite number of members as outlined in the proposed ordinance, and perhaps getting a little bit more definition on who those members will be. For instance, maybe the veteran or the community activist. I think that's a good idea to continue
too.
it, to just tighten this
Right.
up or get the correct language in there. Okay, motion made and seconded, roll call. Yes,
Conway,
Yes.
Council Mercy.
Yes.
3 yeas.
okay. Those are two motions that we'll bring forward. The only other item I just want to mention real quickly is, I think it's good to expand the number of members on our boards through the alternate method. I think, and I'm sure my colleagues agree, it's what boards are open and how do people find out what is open? I think that's the biggest challenge. And if you go to other community websites, if you go on, you can see open positions on, I don't know, Board of Parks, elections, et cetera, that I don't even think this council knows, and I know we discussed it in the past, how can we get sort of a running tally on the website on what's open, what's not open, because I'm sure, people come up to us all the time and say, geez, I'd like to get involved in what's open, and I have to say, I don't know, and I don't know where to send them.
Well,
Councilor Mercer?
there's 2 positions opened on the Council on Aging Board. We'd like to fill those.
I know that there have been discussions, the manager is looking to improve the visibility of the boards and to have on our webpage something that makes it absolutely clear what the roles and responsibilities are and when they're, of these different boards and commissions, and then also when there are openings.
I mean, for instance, if you go to some other websites and you go into employment opportunities, if you will, and I know
Yes.
it is a job, you'll see opening on, Board of Assessor, Board of this, Board of that. So maybe that's the place to do it. And I know we have a lot of boards and it'll take some effort. But if we want to engage folks, I think it's important that we can send them somewhere and they can identify and then apply the same way.
Right, perhaps we can provide the council with an update as to the steps that have already been taken recently and the plans ahead as to what steps are going to be taken to sort of finish finish the task that you're talking about.
Council Mercia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some time ago, many years ago, we had a list, in fact, I have it in my packet over there, of all the boards and commissions, who's on it, when does their term expire. It hasn't been upgraded, so if I could show you what I'm talking about, but if we could have an updated one to see how many boards there are, how many positions are opened, when does their term expire, if we could have how many people are on the board so that we could get an idea of how many more we need to add to it.
Okay, motion by Council Mercia, second by Council Conway, that we get an update on the number of boards and commissions, and also to get an update from the law department on the steps that have already been taken to publicize vacancies on boards and commissions on the city's website.
Yeah.
Sure thing.
Roll call.
Chairman Elliott.
Yes.
Council Conway.
Yes.
Council Mercia.
Yes.
3 yeas.
3 yeas. Up against the clock. Motion to adjourn by Council Mercia, second by Council Conway. All those in favor signify by saying aye. And the opposed, that motion carries. This meeting stands adjourned.